I felt myself separating from my body and looking at it from an outside perspective as it was going down the mountainside, picking up speed, going greater and greater. And then finally I blacked out. And I woke up, with, some of my friends, shaking me, you okay? What's, you know, and I had landed in a snowdrift at the bottom of the hill. And they told me the way that you came down is the only way that you could have survived. If you'd gone off this direction or that direction, you'd have been gone.
My guest today is Michael Cremo. Michael is an American independent researcher who describes himself as a Vedic creationist and an alternative archaeologist. He argues that humans have lived on the earth for millions of years. This is based on artifacts found in the Eocene auriferous gravels of Table Mountain, California, and many other pieces of information, all of which are discussed in his book, Forbidden Archeology. Forbidden Archeology is an incredible text which contains over 900 pages of detailed primary source documentation of the ancient history of humanity. Cremo argues for the existence of modern humans on Earth for as long as 30 to 40, even more, million years ago. And when I first learned of him, I knew we had to get him on the show and learn more about his ideas. I'm really grateful to have the chance to speak with him, and we welcome him back anytime. Just want to say as well, don't forget to like and subscribe this video if you're enjoying this content. I'd love if you'd leave me a comment down below. I'd like to be able to get conversations going here with the audience. Tell me what you found most interesting about this discussion, or ask a question, whatever you feel comfortable with. And also, if you have a guest for the show yourself or someone that you know, feel free to contact me in the description of this video. My email is right there, and you can go ahead and send me an email. So without further ado, here's my interview with Michael Cremo. So Michael, I wanted to start just by getting an understanding of how you got into this. Particularly, why did you decide to investigate the archaeological record in the first place?
Well, that's a very good question, James. I think it has something to do with how I was raised and the path of life that I took. My father was an intelligence officer in the Air Force, so that meant a few things for me as I was growing up. One thing it meant was traveling to a lot of different places and living in a lot of different places. And that meant getting exposed to different points of view, ways of looking at things. So that was an important experience for me. And growing up among people in the intelligence services, I very quickly learned there are things going on in the world that many people are not aware of. There is such a thing as confidential knowledge or hidden knowledge, things of that sort. So among the different worldviews and cultures I was exposed to, the spiritual worldview of ancient India was attractive to me. I liked the idea of reincarnation and things like meditation and yoga. And I began to investigate, study the Vedic text upon which that tradition is based. And in those writings, I found accounts of human populations on this planet going back very far in time, much further than the accounts I was getting from my teachers in high school or university. So I began to wonder, is there any truth to these accounts? Is there some physical evidence to back it up? Or is it perhaps just some mythological invention? So that got me looking into the history of archaeology. In the current textbooks of archaeology, I found only evidence that supports the current dominant idea that humans like us first appeared on this planet only a few 100,000 years ago. And I thought, well, based on my experience growing up among people involved in the intelligence services, I thought, well, maybe there's more to it than we can find in the textbooks today. So I decided to look at the original scientific reports, not what's in the textbooks, but the primary scientific literature, the original reports by archaeologists, other scientists digging into the earth like geologists and paleontologists. And when I did that, I found many credible reports of discoveries of human bones, human artifacts, human footprints, going back much further in time than current dominant theories would allow for. So I collected those reports and put them in the book Forbidden Archeology. I had a question. If these reports are there in the primary scientific literature, if they actually are there, then why aren't they in the textbooks? And that led me to posit a process of knowledge filtration that goes on in the world of science. And the way it works is that evidence that conforms to the dominant theories passes through the filter, whereas evidence that radically contradicts it tends to be not spoken about, set aside, dismissed on very flimsy grounds, things like that. So that's why I called the topic Forbidden Archeology.
I see. Is there a reason in your mind, other than human nature, just a desire not to upset the status quo, or there are entrenched ideologies? Maybe somebody wrote a textbook about something, and to admit that there was an inconsistency in that text would be to admit that maybe they were in error. Is there anything more to the reason why there would be such a filtration system? Is there any malicious intent in your view, or is this purely just the nature of humanity to have this type of filtration bias?
We all engage in knowledge filtration to a certain extent. We don't accept everything that anyone happens to tell us as being the truth. Now, what often happens, however, is that double standards can be applied. I mean, I can tell you why I filter knowledge in a certain way. I'll give you my biases, my preconvictions, everything like that. And I'll try to be consistent in the way that I apply those standards. But what often happens is that people don't apply the standards in an equal way. For example, if you have a building inspector, for somebody he likes, maybe something is not right up to code with the building, lets it pass. It's not a serious thing. But for someone he doesn't like, every little deviation from the code will be brought up, and his license or project will be shut down. Or it happens with police sometimes. Somebody goes a little 5 minutes over the speed limit. All right. Somebody that the policeman or woman may not like, for any of various reasons, goes 5 miles over the speed limit, is immediately stopped, ticketed, inspected, So something like that happens in the intellectual world, the scientific world as well. And the reasons behind it have something to do, I believe, with power. There are different types of power in the world. There's military power, there's political power, there's economic power. There's also intellectual power. And those who possess power like this like to keep it. You know, for example, if a particular political party has a monopoly in the political life of a country, it wants to keep its position. If a company has a monopoly in a particular sector of the economy, it likes to maintain its position. So if there's a group of scientists or intellectuals who are committed to a particular worldview, they like to keep it intact. And I would say the basic conflict down through history in the world of science, what we can call science, because it went on, you know, before the word science was invented. There have always been philosophers committed to different worldviews. You know, if you look at the ancient cultures, but also going into modern times, the basic conflict has been between those who take a physicalist view of the cosmos, where everything comes down to matter, even consciousness. And the opposite worldview is that, well, matter is not primary, but consciousness is primary. And for the past few centuries, we've seen the matter-based conception of the universe be dominant. And that means the people who maintain that point of view would define our identity in a very materialistic way. They would say, we're machines made of molecules, that's all there is to it. Consciousness is just a temporary byproduct of bioelectrical activity in the brain. At the time of death, when the chemicals in the brain become disorganized, there's no more consciousness. Everything is matter only. That sense of identity, if that's what our sense of identity is, then our goals, values, and objectives in life will tend to be extremely materialistic. We'll think that to produce and consume more and more material things is the main purpose of human existence. The position of archaeology in all this is it keeps human identity focused on that material identification. And by doing that, you know, by focusing human activity on material production and consumption, it generates a lot of wealth, but the wealth is distributed in an unequal fashion, whereas some benefit more than others from it, and they would like to keep that position intact. Because if we had another sense of identity, I'm not a machine made of molecules in competition with others for survival individually and collectively, then if we had instead the idea, I'm a being of pure consciousness, you're a being of pure consciousness, we're all beings of pure consciousness, let's not divide ourselves up into competing, warring groups. Let's cooperatively satisfy our material needs in the most simple, natural, fair, and efficient way possible, while putting most of our human energy into developing the resource of consciousness. We would have a different sort of society with different political institutions, different types of financial institutions, economic activity. It would be a little bit different. And I think that's the ultimate reason why the knowledge filtering goes on, because you tend to see that what gets filtered out is not just archaeological evidence for extreme human antiquity, but evidence for life on other planets, evidence that the conscious self is different than the matter in the brain, that a conscious self can survive death and go on to experience future lives, things of that sort that usually come under the heading of the paranormal. All that tends to be filtered out because the implications of it are so profound that it would result in a major change in our whole way of life.
I see. So essentially what you're saying is it's sort of a natural byproduct of human nature and perhaps particularly the Western society that we live inside of, which makes sense. I completely agree with that. I guess what I would be curious to understand is, for you, it sounded like you started to read some religious texts and then began to question the history of humanity. What particularly, when you point to these primary source documents, what specifically gave you pause where you had to then begin to think, okay, maybe the history of humanity is a lot older than I think? Are there any particular insights that you found, any particular primary source documents or archaeological sites that are worth mentioning to sort of make that case?
Well, yes, James. I'll comment a little bit on your introduction to your question. If I hadn't read the accounts of extreme human antiquity in these ancient writings, I wouldn't have had any reason to really question what I already learned from my teachers in high school and university about this. So sometimes, taking a different point of view or considering a different point of view will raise the question. That's what got me looking into the primary scientific literature. Now, it could have happened that when I looked at the primary scientific literature, it all lined up with what's in the current textbooks. That's something that could have happened. So you're right to ask about what was it that you encountered in this study of these documents that convinced you. So when I initially got into this topic, I thought I was aware of a few anomalies, a few discoveries that contradicted the current views. And I thought, well, let me do a few days, maybe 8 days of research, see what I can find. Maybe it won't be anything. But I found one case, which led to another case, which led to another one. So the 8 days turned into 8 weeks. The 8 weeks turned into 8 months. That turned into 8 years of research, because one case just kept following another. One thing I noticed when I first started looking into the topic was that Charles Darwin had published his book, The Origin of Species, in the year 1859. And it was then that people really started thinking about the process of evolution, that human beings must have evolved from more primitive ape-like ancestors at a certain point in time. And I noticed that scientists began searching for what they call a missing link, a being intermediate between the ancient apes and the modern humans like us. So it turned out that no such missing link was discovered until the end of the 19th century, around 1894, around that time, when a Dutch researcher named Eugene Dubois discovered what he called Pithecanthropus erectus, the Java ape-man, at a site called Trinil in Java, which was a Dutch colony at the time. And there in an excavation he found a very primitive-looking skull cap, and a human-like femur or thigh bone. He found them about 50 feet apart, but he put them together and said, here's our missing link. Now, I had to wonder why it took so long, from, say, 1860 to almost the year 1900. What was going on the previous decades before that discovery. And I started looking at archaeology textbooks from the 1860s, the 1870s, the 1880s. And in those textbooks, I found that scientists were making discoveries, but they weren't finding bones or artifacts that you could attribute to some intermediate creature. They were finding skeletal remains and artifacts of the type that are normally attributed to humans like us. Mm. And then, when that Java man discovery became widely accepted in the world of science, they stopped talking about these other discoveries because the Java man discoveries were dated as being less than 1 million years old, whereas some of these older discoveries from the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s were from millions of years ago. So when they finally found their missing link, they thought, well, what are we going to do with all this evidence that accumulated over the past 30 or 40 years? They stopped talking about it or dismissed it on very flimsy grounds. And from that time on, whenever anything was discovered that looked human and was older than 1 million years ago, they explained it away, made it fit somehow into their theories. So that's what really, it was that kind of thing. Seeing this process of knowledge filtration and operation that really convinced me that there's something to this idea, that humans like us have been around for a lot longer than many now think possible.
I see.
I could give you some specific examples. For example, the California gold mine discoveries that were reported to the scientific world by Dr. J.D. Whitney in the year 1880. He was the chief government geologist of California, and discoveries made in the California gold mines. There was a gold rush in California in the mid-19th century. Miners came from all over the place to get the gold, and they were digging tunnels into the sides of mountains like Table Mountain in Tuolumne County and in central California. And deep inside these tunnels, the miners were finding human artifacts like obsidian spear points, stone mortars and pestles, human bones, anatomically modern, and layers of rock that modern geologists tell us are about 50 million years old. So he reported them in a publication that came out from Harvard University in the year 1880. But a few years later, an anthropologist from the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C., William Holmes, said if Dr. Whitney had understood the theory of human evolution, he wouldn't have announced those discoveries, despite the imposing array of evidence with which he was confronted. In other words, if the facts didn't go along with the new theory, they had to be cast into oblivion. And basically that's what happened to them. But some of the artifacts from the California gold mines are still in the collection of the Museum of Anthropology at the University of California at Berkeley. They're not shown to the public, but I was able to get access to them. They're not kept in the museum itself. They're kept in a storage building a few miles away. But they are still there. And you wouldn't even know they existed unless you're someone like me who looks into these things. So that's one of the very good examples that was very convincing to me. And in his 1880 publication, Whitney mentioned in a little footnote, and similar discoveries have been made in Europe by Carlos Ribeiro, head of the Geological Survey of the country of Portugal, and he gave a little reference. So I tracked that down and got it, and was just amazed by the discoveries he made in his country of Portugal. And then he would mention in a little footnote, and similar discoveries had been made by Dr. So-and-so in France. And then I'd go to that one and as I said, it just went on and on and on. Now, up to the present day, sometimes archaeologists discover something that is actually evidence for extreme human antiquity. For example, Mary Leakey, who was the wife of Louis Leakey, a prominent archaeologist, and she was herself a great archaeologist. She discovered at a place called Laetoli in the country of Tanzania in East Africa footprints that she said were exactly like modern human footprints. They were found in layers of rock 3,700,000 years old.
Wow.
Now, although she said they were just like human footprints, and other scientists also agreed, she didn't call them human. She said, well, there must have been some type of Australopithecus creature, some kind of ape man that existed at that time that had feet, just like modern human feet. Now, the foot bones of Australopithecus have been discovered, and their foot structure is not like that of a modern human being. It's more like that of a chimpanzee with very long toes, kind of like human fingers, and a first toe that can move out to the side like the human thumb. So their footprints are not like modern human footprints. So, I mean, it's a very interesting example of how scientists will interpret evidence so that it fits the current theories, when it could just as well be taken as evidence that human beings have been around for a lot longer than we think possible, or they think possible.
Right. Fascinating. So you mentioned that was a more modern example. What would you say is the most modern example of, in archaeology, of this?
Well, a recent example, fairly recent, came from a discovery that was made in 2016. there was a team of archaeologists working at Olduvai Gorge in East Africa. It's a very famous site where many important discoveries have been made. So what they found, this may seem insignificant, but there's something to be learned from it. They found a finger bone. It's actually this bone here. You see there's 3 bones.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a proximal, mammal, 5th proximal, manual finger bone. So it's they carefully studied it. They measured it, and they analyzed it, and they compared the measurements with the measurements of the same bone from different species of ape men, different species of apes and monkeys, baboons, gorillas, chimpanzees, Australopithecus, Homo erectus, and they also compared it with the same finger bone in populations of modern humans. And they found in their study that this bone that they found, which was about 1.8 million years old, fit in the modern human group, not in that of any of the ape men or apes and monkeys. And what they said in the report was very interesting. They said the closest examples that are similar to this bone are from anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens. But we can't call this Homo sapiens because of the geological age of the formation in which it was found. And to me, that is a huge red flag. They study this bone. They say it's 1.8 million years old. They say it's just like that of anatomically modern humans, but we can't call it that because it wouldn't fit, basically. So that's a fairly recent example of how the knowledge filtering process goes on when archaeologists encounter evidence like this. It's almost like, I'm not alone in saying this. There are many historians of science and philosophers of science who maintain that scientific paradigms influence how scientists receive evidence that comes to their attention. If it fits the paradigm, fine. If it doesn't fit the paradigm, it gets set aside, forgotten, or sometimes explained away so that it fits the paradigm, or sometimes suppressed. So that happens. There was a famous example that was given by one historian and philosopher of science about a card experiment that was done by some psychologist. What they did is they took a deck of cards, a standard deck of cards, and they altered some of the cards. Say like you have a 6 of hearts. Normally it's red. They put 6 of hearts black. And throughout the deck they altered different cards like that. And what they would do is they would show a subject, a person, one card after another, and asked the person to identify it. And and they show them one card, another card, then say the altered 6 of hearts, black, and they would just say 6 of spades or something. In other words, they could be directly looking at something and not really see it for what it is. They just saw it how they expected to see it. You know, if there's six figures there and black. So that often that same sort of thing happens in the scientific world. Scientists can be directly looking at something, but they won't recognize it for what it really is. They'll make it fit somehow into their accepted paradigm.
I see. That's a great explanation or analogy to what is happening, not just in science, but I think in other disciplines as well. What would what would you say are the major implications if what is being described here is true? If humanity is millions, tens of millions, potentially even hundreds of years old, what are the implications of that? And why don't we see, I guess, substantial evolution over that course of time? Why is it that we're only now getting to a point where we have the technology that we do?
Well, there's a few things to be said about that question. One of the implications is that we need new explanations for human origins. People would ask me that question after they read Forbidden Archeology, which is basically about stones and bones indicating a human presence further back in time than modern ideas allow. So you could say, well, what difference does it really make if human beings have been around for 100,000 years or 100 million years? What difference does it make? The difference that it makes is that if this evidence is accepted, then we need a new explanation for our origins. And as I suggested a little bit earlier in our talk, that new explanation, I believe, is going to have to involve consciousness. And that has huge implications for our whole way of life. It would change the foundations upon which our whole worldwide industrial technological civilization is based. That it leads ultimately to a consciousness-based picture of the universe instead of a matter-based picture of the universe. So I think that has big implications. That is what I see as the major outcome of evidence like this.
Interesting. So for you personally, having spent so much time looking into this, and not just the primary source documentation, but also from the other angle, that being the perspective of the Vedic texts, what to you is that explanation? How did humanity come to be?
Well, that depends upon understanding that the human body and any other type of material body, be it plant or animal or whatever, is a vehicle for a conscious self. So that is an important part of understanding how we came to be. Now, that would mean that as conscious, individual, personal beings, we do not evolve up from matter. It's not that consciousness comes from matter. Consciousness has its own independent existence. It is actually, if you look deeply into it, and we all sense this, it's not subject to birth and death. In other words, it's eternal. And that is the actual purpose of human life, is to restore consciousness to its original pure state, which is beyond the endless cycle of temporary embodiments on the material level of reality. Means getting out of what in Sanskrit is called samsara, the wheel of repeated births and deaths in this world in various kinds of temporary material embodiments. So that suggests that we're not accidental creatures in an accidental universe. There's some purpose for our existence on this plane of reality, where consciousness is associated with material coverings that we call bodies. So, according to the Vedic texts, the human bodily vehicle is the most important, because the conscious self in the human form can understand and act upon the kinds of things that we've been discussing. According to one's level of consciousness, one gets a certain type of bodily vehicle. And on this level of reality, we have two choices. We can become more and more deeply involved in trying to dominate, control, and exploit material resources individually and collectively in groups. And this leads to conflict and violence on all levels of human society. And it also results in environmental destruction and so many other problems that we just see, as we look out at the world. So that is one path. And the other path is to try to understand, okay, I'm not a machine made of matter in competition with others for survival and dominance, but I'm part of a whole harmonious group of conscious, intelligent, personal beings that have a relationship with a source that is also conscious, individual, and personal. Now, because that, I think, is the purpose of the universe, and that purpose is best realized in the human form, that human form should always have been available to conscious selves on this level of reality. It's like we're sending a space station up into Earth orbit. You make a self-assembling space station, and we don't just hope that somehow or other the chemicals inside the space station will combine together somehow and gradually evolve into astronauts. we make the space station because we've got astronauts that we're ready to send up there and use it as soon as it's ready. So in the same way, our universe is not some cosmic accident, the result of some fluctuation, random fluctuation of some quantum mechanical vacuum. It has a purpose, and that purpose is best realized in the human form of life. So it's always been available, not just in this universe, because according to the Vedic cosmology, there are unlimited numbers of universes. And there are many in the world of science today who actually accept the idea that there's not just one universe, there may be many. But they go through vast cycles of creation and destruction, or manifestation and non-manifestation. And this human vehicle is always available in any of those universes at any time in their manifestation state. And that basically means the human form, the human bodily vehicle, is eternal in the sense that it's always there throughout all of this process of manifestation and non-manifestation on this level. But if one properly uses the human form, then you're out of the matrix, so to speak, out of the virtual reality system that we're now part of.
I see. There's a lot to think about there. And I think what's really fascinating to me personally is that as I read more about science, I start to realize that science is just using different words to describe a lot of the same concepts that have been talked about in religions throughout the millennia. And what you're describing here falls directly in line with that. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your own personal experience. Have you had any anomalous experiences, things that you just couldn't explain or put in a box, kind of that, map to this whole idea of us being consciousness-based people as opposed to physical matter-based people?
Well, yes, I have had some experiences like that. There are not a whole lot of them, but they have been very influential. When I was a lot younger, back in my early 20s, I was in the Navy and I was stationed in Iceland at a weather station in Iceland up, near the Arctic Circle. And the way my schedule was, I would be working a few days and then I would get 4 days off. And during those 4 days off, I would explore Iceland, which is a really fascinating place. So once in the wintertime, some friends of mine and I from the naval station there went camping in the mountains of Iceland in the middle of winter. We like to do stuff like that. And we decided one night, of course in the winter time, the night lasts 23 hours, but we were a little bit intoxicated, you might say, and we decided to race up the side of a mountain. Now, it wasn't like Mount Everest, maybe a few thousand feet tall. It was covered with snow and ice. So we kind of, there were about 4 of us on this trip, and we started racing up the side of the mountain. And I could see I was ahead of the others, so I was moving as rapidly as I can up to the top of the large hill or small mountain. And when I was just about at the top, I slipped on the ice. And I was wearing a winter parka that was kind of, it was a plastic type of outer covering to it. So it was very slippery, and I kind of started going down the hill on my back. And I was thinking of all the sharp rocks I had climbed over, all the cliffs I had wended my way around. And I was thinking, I'm going to either split my skull when I hit those rocks, or I'm going to go off one of those cliffs and it's going to be over. So I was trying as hard as I could to stop the fall, digging in my feet, my heels, doing anything possible to stop. But at a certain point, I realized it's not going to stop. Gravity had kind of taken over, and it's going faster and faster. At a certain point, I just had to let go mentally.
Right.
It's not in my hands anymore. And I felt myself separating from my body and looking at it from an outside perspective as it was going down the mountainside, picking up speed, going greater and greater. And then finally I blacked out. And I woke up, with some of my friends, shaking me, you okay? What? And I had landed in a snowdrift at the bottom of the hill. And they told me, the way that you came down is the only way that you could have survived. If you'd gone off this direction or that direction, you'd have been gone. So that was a really interesting experience that got me thinking that there might be something more than, molecules involved in my existence.
Right.
And later, I learned about scientifically documented cases of out-of-body experiences. So that gave me another way to interpret the experience. But, at the time, I wasn't aware of those medical studies that have been done on phenomena like that.
Right. Did you see anything besides your body? Or did you watch yourself and then you lost consciousness?
I watched myself and I lost consciousness.
Okay.
I didn't
Some people describe
perceive
a
any-
light or going to a certain place, so I was just curious.
Yeah, I didn't have an experience like that.
Okay. That's
I-
powerful.
I know from studying the reports, some people have reported going through tunnels, seeing different personalities, angelic beings, or in some cases, the opposite of angelic.
Right. A little bit darker in terms of the
Yeah.
theme. Wow, that's really interesting. I'm always curious because I think a lot of the folks who have made substantial impacts in whether it be this space or others, a lot of them have really unique experiences like that, and I think that kind of spurs them to try to do big things in the world. And so thank you for sharing that. I appreciate you doing so. I just wanted to kind of wrap things up. I know that we're getting close to our time here, and I want to respect your time, but I was hoping you could go into some detail just about how has the reception been towards your book since you published in 1993? Have you seen people begin to open up to these ideas? Are textbooks beginning to potentially include this kind of information? And what do you want people to take away from this conversation and from your book, Forbidden Archeology?
Yeah, the reactions from the mainstream scientific community, say the archaeologists, for example, have been varied because actually the scientific world is not completely monolithic. There are different groups of scientists, different groups of archaeologists with different perspectives and ways of looking at things. Among archaeologists, for example, I see two basic groups. There is the archaeology singular group and the archaeology's plural group. The archaeology singular group tends to think there's one objective Western scientific archaeology that is matter-based, and it is the only archaeology that's worth pursuing. And archaeologists or scientists of that persuasion don't like what I do. They don't want to hear about it. They don't want anyone else to hear about it. They, their reaction to the work has been negative, to dismiss it, of course, even that is significant because usually they just try to ignore stuff that goes against their ideas, but I guess they felt threatened enough that they had to say some very negative things in their reviews of the work, or they might try to get lectures that I've been scheduled to give at universities or scientific conferences canceled. That sort of thing can happen. But that's not the only group. There's another group, the archaeology's plural group, that has an understanding that modern Western scientific archaeology is just one of many possible archaeologies. There can be many archaeologies with different epistemological and ontological commitments. For example, they would say there can be an Australian Aboriginal archaeology or a Native American Indian archaeology with roots in those wisdom traditions. And similarly, there might be a Vedic archaeology of the kind that I'm committed to. So it's scientists from that group who have had, and I'm not saying that they totally approve of everything I say or my followers are committed, but they're open-minded enough to be willing to listen to an alternative. And I think that's an important first step if ideas are going to change. Archaeologists, other scientists have to be willing to listen to another idea. So it's archaeologists in that category who have written some very positive things about forbidden archaeology. They did that in their reviews that were published in some of the major scientific and academic journals that deal with human origins and antiquity. For example, a very well-known historian of science, David Oldroyd, and his graduate student, Joe Wodak, wrote a 23-page review article about forbidden archaeology in an academic journal called Social Studies of Science. And in their review, they asked the question, has forbidden archaeology made a contribution to the literature on paleoanthropology? That's a study of human origins and antiquity. So they said yes for two reasons. First of all, they said, as professional historians of science, that they had never seen any book go as deeply into the history of archaeology as my book. And they also said it raises important questions about the certainty of scientific truth claims. In other words, scientists attach different levels of certainty to their theories. And to their theories of human evolution, they attach a very high level of certainty. It's almost completely correct according to what they're thinking.
Doctrine.
And these historians of science said, well, maybe they need to rethink that and reduce the level of certainty that they attach to that theory.
Right.
So So scientists or archaeologists in this archeologies group, they said things like that. And they've also accepted my proposals to present papers at their major international conferences, where I presented dozens of papers about my work, and many of them have been published in their peer-reviewed scientific books and journals. So there's a variety. Now, among those in that group, there may be one or two, a few who actually agree with most of what I say. But I think that's natural. I mean, it would be nice to be born in a time and place when one's personal convictions are widely accepted by elite groups in the society in which one lives, but that's not always the case. Sometimes you have to stand up for your convictions when many of the elites in the society in which you live aren't sharing the same convictions.
That's, I think, the mark of a true thinker is somebody who doesn't just follow what they're told, but asks why and how can you prove that. So for my last question, I just wanted to see if I could get your opinion on how people can get involved in this. If people have read your book or are watching this now and they feel compelled to further this type of research, how can the everyday average person forward and get progress into learning more about our ancient past?
Yeah, it's interesting that you asked that. I was contacted recently by a researcher who had heard me speak at her university many years ago, and she said it really influenced her to finish her degree in archaeology. And I had suggested to her that there are different ways to go. You could try to work within the archaeological system to push things in the right direction. Now, by taking that path, you may not be able to make big progress, but even pushing things incrementally within the system would be useful. That would be one option for you. Now, I wish I could say there were institutions that are prepared to give grants and support this kind of research. That's not really a viable option at the present moment. Maybe someday it will. But I said the other way you could go would be to start writing and speaking about these things on your own. And she took that path and is now a voice in the alternative archaeology community. So, as I don't have her permission to reveal this whole history, I'm not going to mention the name, but yeah, that is one option. The other option, if one doesn't feel one's ready oneself to make a research contribution or writing contribution, is just to become more and more aware of what's going on in these circles and become better informed yourself and try to get others to share your interest. So those are the kinds of paths forward that I can see right now.
Thanks for providing that detail. I know that there's definitely folks who care about these kinds of things, and it's helpful to know from somebody like yourself what they can do to get involved. And to whoever that lovely lady is, we'd love to have her here if she wants to talk about this in further detail. So, Michael, thank you so much for sitting down with me and taking your time to teach me and others about your research. To close things out, where can people learn more about you?
Well, a good place to start would be my website, mcremo.com, mcremo.com. And there they could find a list of upcoming media events, like they would have been able to see that I'm going to be on your podcast when you give the link for it.
Yep.
And they could also see a list of upcoming lectures. Like in October, I'll be speaking at the Ancient American Artifact Preservation Society Conference. That'll be listed in the events link on the website. And they can also find my books available on the website. We have a special offer now for 5 of my books: The Hidden History of the Human Race, Human Devolution, The Forbidden Archeologist, and My Science, My Religion. Those we're offering 5 of them for a special low price of $100. So that would, I mean, if people are really interested in getting into all the types of topics that we've been talking about, I hope they take advantage of that offer.
That's good to know. mcremo.com. Go check it out. Thank you again, Michael Cremo. It's been a real pleasure sitting down with you today.
Thank you for your questions. And just like to say, it's if people want to become involved, one way is to become involved in the research, and another is to communicate it, as I believe you're doing through your efforts.
That's what this is all about. Just trying to share really cool ideas and hopefully get other people talking about them. Oh, hey, you're still here? Well, thanks for watching this far. I really appreciate you doing so. Maybe consider subscribing to the show. Also, leave me a comment in the description below with what you found most interesting about this video, or just make fun of me. That's great too. Either way, if you have a guest that you think would be good for the show, there's a contact in the description of this video. I look forward to seeing you at the next one. Thank you.